The trauma room went dead silent when a young nurse dropped the ultrasound probe onto the cart and said, quietly but absolutely, "He's bleeding where nobody's looking." The chief surgeon turned from the table, scalpel in hand, and stared at her the way doctors stare at things they've already decided don't matter. Then he grabbed her by the elbow and physically moved her aside. Not aggressively, just efficiently, the way you'd move a cart blocking a hallway. Nobody in that room said a word. Nobody stopped him. 30 seconds later, the patient's blood pressure hit the floor, and every alarm in the trauma bay started screaming at once. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where the stories nobody talks about finally get told. Every single week, we bring you real cinematic drama. Stories of people who were overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated until they weren't. If this kind of story is what you came for, you're exactly in the right place. Hit the like button so more people can find us, and drop a comment below telling us what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. Huron Valley Medical Center sat at the edge of Caldwell, Oregon, the kind of mid-sized city that liked to call itself a community while functioning like a corporation. The hospital had been built with state funding in the late 90s, expanded twice since then, and had recently acquired a brand new trauma wing that the board chairman, Gerald Pruitt, had photographed himself standing in front of for the hospital's annual report. The trauma wing had high ceilings, new lighting, and a set of automatic doors that had been quietly malfunctioning since March. Nobody had fixed them. Nora Voss arrived for her shift at 6:42 in the morning, 18 minutes before her clock-in time, the same way she arrived every day she worked. She pulled into the staff lot, cut the engine on her 12-year-old Civic, and sat for exactly 1 moment with her eyes closed. Not meditating, not praying, just resetting. She had a habit of leaving whatever was behind her in the car. The silence of her apartment, the half-eaten breakfast, the particular quality of early morning quiet that she privately admitted she loved more than almost anything. She left all of that in the car and walked in as someone else. At 33, Nora Voss had the kind of face that people consistently underestimated. It wasn't a soft face. Her jaw was too set, her eyes too still for soft. But something about the combination of her age, her uniform, and the fact that she never raised her voice made senior staff consistently file her under competent but junior. She had worked at Huron Valley for 2 years. In those 2 years, she had quietly caught 4 medication errors that could have caused serious harm, had twice identified deteriorating patients that the attending had initially cleared, and had never once been formally acknowledged for any of it. She had also never pushed back in any way that made people uncomfortable. That was the point. The morning started without drama. She clocked in, signed off on the overnight report from the charge nurse, Deborah Molina, who looked like she hadn't slept since Thursday, and took her first patient, a 47-year-old man named Roy, who had chest pain that turned out to be indigestion and a lot of anxiety about turning 48. She got him a ginger ale. He told her she was the nicest person he'd met all year. She thanked him, rechecked his vitals, and moved on. At 8:15, Trauma Bay 1 received a critical. The call came over the radio first. Motor vehicle collision, 44-year-old male, unrestrained driver, T-bone impact on the driver's side at approximately 50 miles per hour. Initial responders reported diminished breath sounds on the right, a GCS of 10, and BP running low. The trauma team mobilized. Nora fell in as part of the secondary team, taking her position at the left side of the bay to manage IV access and monitor readouts. She had her first look at him when the gurney came through the doors. His name, she would learn later, was Marcus Hale. At the moment he arrived, he was a body in a cervical collar with road rash across the left side of his face and a tension in his jaw that spoke to the fact that some part of him, despite his compromised consciousness, was still fighting very hard. She noted his skin color, pale, slightly ashen, the particular pallor of someone whose body was working extraordinarily hard to compensate for something. She noted his breathing, which was labored in a way that wasn't quite consistent with the right-side pneumothorax the paramedics had flagged. She noted the slight distension below his left ribs that no one else was looking at because the chest was where the action seemed to be. She filed all of that away and did her job. IV access, right antecubital, secured in under 40 seconds. She verbally reported his pressure to the team, 88/60 and dropping, and reached for the portable ultrasound without announcing it, because in this bay, if you waited to announce everything you were going to do, the patient died while you were still talking. Dr. Garrett Marsh entered the trauma bay at 8:21. The shift in the room was immediate and physical. People stood slightly straighter, moved with slightly more deliberateness, spoke with slightly more precision. Marsh had that effect. He was the chief of trauma surgery at Heron Valley, a tall man in his mid-50s with the specific brand of confidence that develops in people who have been told they're exceptional for long enough that they've stopped questioning it. His surgical outcomes were genuinely good. His interpersonal skills were genuinely not. He had twice been the subject of HR complaints from nursing staff for dismissive conduct, and twice those complaints had been quietly resolved in ways that involved the staff member in question eventually transferring to another department. "Status," he said, pulling on his gloves. The senior resident, Dr. Paul Wexler, ran it down. Right-sided pneumothorax suspected, chest X-ray pending, pressure unstable, GCS fluctuating between 8 and 11. Marsh nodded, already moving. "Get me a chest tube tray." Nora was still running the ultrasound probe across the abdomen. She was working quickly, systematically, her eyes moving between the screen and the patient, and what she was seeing was making her internal calculus shift in a way she recognized. The way she always recognized it. The kind of pattern recognition that wasn't quite teachable and wasn't quite explainable but was absolutely real. The product of hundreds of hours in situations where wrong answers weren't graded, they were buried. The probe told her what she already suspected. Free fluid. Not in the chest. In the abdomen. Left upper quadrant, significant and growing. She straightened and spoke at a normal volume. "I'm seeing free fluid in the abdomen. Left upper quadrant. I think the primary bleed might be abdominal." The room didn't stop, but it paused in the way rooms pause when someone says something unexpected in the wrong register. Marsh looked at her for the first time. "Who are you?" "Nora Voss. I'm the secondary trauma nurse on this. The X-ray is going to show a pneumo," he said, turning back to Wexler. "That's our priority. The chest tube goes in first." "The pressure's too low for isolated pneumo," she said. "If the primary source is abdominal, I appreciate the input." His tone made clear that he did not. "But this isn't a collaborative exercise. You're managing IV access. Do that." She looked at the monitor. BP 82/54. She looked at the ultrasound screen. She looked at Marcus Hale's face. She stepped back. She kept her eyes on the monitor. Wexler began prepping for the chest tube. Marsh talked him through it with the specific economy of a surgeon who had done this procedure enough times that he'd stopped thinking of it as something that required explanation. The chest tube went in at 8:27. A small amount of air and blood evacuated. The right side of the chest decompressed. The pressure went to 79/48. Marsh frowned. "He's not responding." "Because the bleed isn't in the chest," Nora said. The words came out flat. Not aggressive, not emotional, just accurate. Marsh turned and looked at her with an expression she had seen before on different faces in different places. The expression of someone who has decided that the problem in the room is the person speaking rather than what they're saying. "I told you." The monitor alarm changed pitch. BP 61/30. The room moved differently now, faster, sharper, with the specific quality of motion that arrives when everyone in a room simultaneously understands that the situation has escalated beyond management into emergency. Wexler called out the pressure. A nurse on the right side pushed fluids. Someone called for the attending anesthesiologist. Nora was already moving. She didn't ask permission. She had stopped asking permission for things like this a long time ago, in a context that Garrett Marsh knew nothing about, and that she had worked very deliberately to keep invisible. She moved to the ultrasound, repositioned the probe, confirmed what she'd seen at 8:22, and looked up at Marsh. "He has a splenic rupture, possibly hepatic involvement. The fluid accumulation has increased in the last 4 minutes. He needs the OR right now, and he needs it for the abdomen, not the chest." Marsh stared at her. She held his gaze without flinching or modifying the expression on her face. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He looked at the screen for 3 seconds. Something crossed his face. Not quite acknowledgement, not quite doubt, something compressed and complicated that resolved itself almost immediately into the professional necessity of forward motion. "Get me OR2, he said to the room. "Call the blood bank. Type and cross for 8 units. Let's move." As the team mobilized, Marsh stepped close enough to Nora that his voice didn't carry to the rest of the bay. "You don't speak over me in my trauma room." "Understood," she said. I don't care what you think you know. I understand. Your job is IV access and monitoring, she said. I know what my job is. He held her gaze for one more beat, then he walked away. She stood in the now emptying trauma bay, one hand still resting on the ultrasound cart, and watched through the window as the team wheeled Marcus Hale toward the elevator. She watched until the gurney turned the corner. Then she cleaned the probe, replaced it in its holder, stripped her gloves, and went to check on Roy in Bay 3, who had finished his ginger ale and wanted to know if he could have a magazine. She found him a magazine. She didn't think about what had just happened in the way that other people might think about it. She didn't replay Marcia's face or rehearse what she should have said differently. She had learned to carry moments like that the way you carry something heavy, flat against the body, weight distributed, without letting it show in your stride. What she didn't know, at 8:41 on that Tuesday morning, was that Marcus Hale wasn't a random commuter, that his presence in Caldwell, Oregon, was not accidental, that the vehicle that had struck him had been driven by a man who was already on a watch list in 2 federal databases, and who had been located and detained by local law enforcement 40 minutes after the crash, at which point he had declined to say anything to anyone and had immediately asked for a lawyer. She didn't know any of that. She knew Roy wanted Sports Illustrated, and the rack only had People and something called Pacific Northwest Living, and she was trying to decide if either of those was going to satisfy him. The afternoon brought the kind of mid-shift administrative weight that accumulated in hospitals, the way sediment accumulated in pipes, gradually, invisibly, until suddenly something wasn't flowing right. Nora charted, answered call lights, assisted in a brief cardioversion that went smoothly, and ate half a granola bar at her locker at 1:15 before a rapid response call pulled her back to the floor. The rapid response patient was a 62-year-old post-op who was doing fine by the time she got there, his oxygen sat having corrected itself almost immediately, his nurse looking slightly embarrassed. At 2:30, she was pulled aside by Sandra Price. Sandra was the nursing supervisor for the day shift, a woman in her late 40s who had managed the political terrain of Heron Valley Medical Center for 11 years with the careful, precise navigation of someone who knew exactly where all the landmines were buried. She was not unkind. She was above all practical. "Can we talk for a minute?" They stepped into the small supervisor's office at the end of the hall. Sandra closed the door. She did not sit down. Nora didn't either. "I heard about the situation in trauma this morning." "Okay," Nora said. "Dr. Marsh filed a conduct report. He's saying you repeatedly interrupted the trauma team and challenged his clinical decisions in front of staff and residents. I identified a finding on ultrasound that turned out to be the primary source of the patient's hemorrhage." "I know what happened clinically," Sandra said. She said it not dismissively but carefully, the way you'd handle something fragile. "The patient is in surgery right now, and it sounds like they found what you said they'd find. I know that." "But?" Sandra looked at the middle distance for a moment. "Garrett Marsh has been here for 16 years. He has relationships with the board, with the CMO, with the department chairs. I'm not saying he's right. I'm saying that how this gets processed is going to depend on channels and dynamics that are above my pay grade." "What does that mean practically?" "It means I've been asked to tell you that pending a formal review, you're being placed on administrative leave effective end of shift today." The room held the particular quality of silence that belongs to moments when something expected arrives anyway and still manages to land with full weight. Nora said nothing for 3 seconds. "Who requested the leave?" "The request came from Dr. Marsh through the CMO's office." "Was there a patient safety review conducted?" "That would be part of the formal process, but not before the leave decision." Sandra met her eyes. "No, not before the leave decision." Nora nodded once. She had a very precise relationship with her own emotions. Not suppression, exactly, more like calibration. She knew what she felt. She had learned, a long time ago in a very different environment, that the feeling and the response to the feeling were 2 completely separate things, and that the second one was the only one she had control over. "I'll finish my shift and collect my badge," she said. "Nora, it's fine, Sandra." It wasn't fine. She knew it wasn't fine, and Sandra knew it wasn't fine, and they both knew that saying so wouldn't change the mechanics of what was happening. So Nora said it was fine and went back to her patients, and she cared for each of them for the remaining hours of her shift with the same attention she brought to every shift, because the people in those beds had nothing to do with Garrett Marsh's conduct report and everything to do with why she was here. At 6:48 p.m., she handed off her patients, signed her charts, and surrendered her badge at the supervisor's desk. She walked to her car in the staff lot. She sat down. She closed her eyes. She didn't do the resetting exercise she usually did, the one where she left things in the car before going in. She did a different version now. She tried to put the day inside something manageable. She thought about Marcus Hale on the table. She thought about the ultrasound image, clear as a photograph, the free fluid unmistakable. She thought about the alarm-changing pitch at 61/30. She thought about the fact that she'd been right. She thought about what it cost to be right in certain rooms. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Oregon area code, but not local. She almost didn't answer it. She'd had a long day. She was sitting in a parking lot with a suspended badge, and unknown numbers at 7 p.m. were rarely anything good. But something, not instinct exactly, more like the absence of a reason not to, made her pick up. "Is this Nora Voss?" Male voice. Measured, flat, not unfriendly, but absolutely professional in a way that had nothing to do with customer service or sales. "Who's asking?" "My name is Colonel Daniel Reeves. I'm with the United States Army Medical Command, attached to a joint investigative unit currently operating in Caldwell." A pause that wasn't quite a pause, more like a beat of precision. "The patient you treated this morning in Trauma Bay 1, Marcus Hale." She said nothing. "We need to speak with you, Ms. Voss." "I'm on administrative leave," she said. "You should probably call the hospital." "We're not calling the hospital," he said. "We're calling you. There's a difference." She watched a car back out of the space across from her, its reverse lights white in the dusk. "Why?" she asked. "Because Marcus Hale is not who the hospital's intake paperwork says he is," Reeves said. "And the crash that put him in your trauma bay this morning was not an accident." Another of those precise pauses. "And the fact that you identified his injury when the attending physician did not is something we need to understand better." Her hand on the phone was very still. "Where do you want to meet?" she said. She heard what might have been, on another voice, something like relief. "There's a diner on Caldwell's east side, Birchwood. Do you know it?" "I know it." "1 hour," he said. "Come alone." The call ended. Nora sat in the parking lot for another 30 seconds. The dusk had turned the sky above the tree line a particular color, blue-gray, the color of something about to shift. She put the car in reverse, backed out of the spot, and turned toward the east side of Caldwell. Inside Heron Valley Medical Center, on the 4th floor, in a private room that had been arranged with unusual speed by hospital administration in response to a request from a federal agency whose name had been communicated only in writing, Marcus Hale lay in a monitored bed with 2 IV lines, a drain, and a blood pressure that was, for the first time since 8:15 that morning, stable. His eyes were closed. A man in civilian clothes sat in the chair by the window. He had a phone in his hand but wasn't using it. He was watching the door. Down the hall, at the nurse's station, a staff member whose name tag said Kevin was trying to access Marcus Hale's intake record for routine charting purposes, and finding that the file had been locked behind an access level he didn't have and had never needed before. He called the help desk. The help desk told him the lock had been placed by hospital administration. He asked why. They said they didn't know. He made a note to follow up in the morning and went back to his other charts. On the 3rd floor, in his office, Garrett Marsh sat at his desk with a surgical dictation running and the door closed. He had performed a splenectomy and partial hepatic repair on Marcus Hale that afternoon, and the procedure had gone well, and the patient was stable, and those were the facts that mattered clinically. The facts that mattered in other ways, the woman's ultrasound, her timing, the undeniable accuracy of her call, those he had already begun the process of organizing into a narrative that was manageable. He was good at that. He had been doing it for a long time. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had not dialed in several months. It rang twice. A voice answered. "We might have a problem," Marsh said. The voice on the other end said something brief. "The nurse who was in trauma this morning," Marsh said. "I need to know who she actually is." The man on the phone had said 1 hour, and Nora made it in 43 minutes, which told her more about her own state of mind than she would have liked to admit. Birchwood Diner sat on the corner of Alderman and Route 9, the kind of place that had survived 3 recessions and a highway rerouting by being exactly what it was and nothing more. Vinyl booths, laminate counters, coffee that arrived in a thick ceramic mug before you finished sitting down. The dinner crowd was thin on a Tuesday. A couple in a corner booth, an older man at the counter with a newspaper he wasn't really reading. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with her hair pulled back and the practiced economy of movement that came from years of navigating small spaces efficiently. Colonel Daniel Reeves was already there. She recognized him before he looked up, which was a habit she had never fully shed. The automatic cataloging of a room when she entered it, posture and positioning and sightlines. He was in the second booth from the back, left side, facing the door. Civilian clothes, dark jacket, no tie, nothing that marked him except the way he was sitting, which was the way people sat when they had spent a long time in environments where sitting with your back to a door was something you'd been trained out of. He stood when she approached, which surprised her slightly. "Ms. Voss?" He offered his hand. "Colonel." She shook it and slid into the booth across from him. He was somewhere in his early 50s, she estimated. Close-cropped gray at the temples, a face that had spent time outdoors over a long period. The kind of stillness in his eyes that was different from coldness, more like compression, like someone who had learned to run a lot of internal processing without letting it show on the surface. The waitress appeared. Nora ordered coffee without looking at the menu. Reeves already had one. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You made it sound like not coming wasn't really one of the options." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the acknowledgement of one. "Fair." He opened a folder on the table. Inside was a photograph. Marcus Hale, but not the man who had come in on a gurney that morning. This was a different version of the same man. Upright, in uniform, with a look of concentrated alertness that bore no resemblance to the ashen, barely conscious crash victim she'd worked on in Trauma Bay 1. Staff Sergeant Marcus Hale, Reeves said, retired formally. He separated from service 4 years ago and moved into a federal contractor role. Specifically, he's been working for the past 18 months on an interagency task force investigating financial networks with ties to defense procurement fraud. Nora looked at the photograph. Who hit him? The driver of the vehicle has been identified as a man named Patrick Gorin. He has a long history with a network of individuals currently under federal investigation. We believe the crash was a contracted hit that was staged to look like an accident. He paused. It almost worked. Almost, she said. The injury that would have killed him, the one your attending physician initially missed, would have presented, on preliminary review, as consistent with blunt force trauma from the collision. No one would have looked deeper. His death would have been logged as a crash fatality. He watched her. You look deeper. She lifted her coffee cup. It was hot and slightly too strong, which she didn't mind. I saw what the ultrasound showed. You initiated an ultrasound exam on a trauma patient that the attending surgeon had not yet ordered. That's standard in a lot of trauma facilities. It's called a FAST exam, focused assessment, with sonography for trauma. I was doing my job. You identified a specific injury pattern that an experienced trauma surgeon, with more training than you hold on paper, did not initially identify. She put the cup down. What is it you actually want to know, Colonel? He held her gaze for a moment. Then he closed the folder and set it aside, and when he spoke again, his tone shifted slightly. Less briefing, more conversation. I want to know who you are, he said, because the record we have on Nora Voss, ER nurse, Heron Valley Medical Center, is clean and unremarkable, and tells us essentially nothing about why a trauma nurse in a mid-sized Oregon city reads a FAST exam the way you read that one. The diner was quiet around them. The man at the counter turned a page of his newspaper. Outside, headlights moved slowly past the window. I did a lot of trauma work before I came here, she said. What kind of trauma work? The kind that doesn't make it into a civilian nursing resume. He looked at her steadily. She looked back. This was a particular kind of standoff, the kind where both people at the table already knew the answer, and the only question was which of them was going to say it first, and in what words, and what that would cost. There's a file, he said. In a system I have access to that most people don't. It's not under the name Nora Voss. He paused. I'm not going to say what name it is, but I'd like you to understand that I've read it, and that what you did in that trauma bay this morning is consistent with someone whose actual experience is considerably more extensive than a decade of civilian emergency nursing. She was quiet for a moment. What do you want from me? She asked. Right now. Nothing formal. I want you to know that we're aware of what happened today, both the clinical situation and the administrative action taken against you afterward. We're going to be looking at Heron Valley Medical Center as part of our broader investigation into the network that put Hale in that OR. If there's anything irregular about how that hospital has been operating, he stopped. I want you to know we're looking. And me? Me? You're not a suspect, Ms. Voss. You're the reason our asset is still breathing. She absorbed that. She thought about Marcia's voice, low and close, in the trauma bay. You don't speak over me in my trauma room. And the click of her badge being deposited on Sandra Price's desk, and the way the parking lot had felt at 6:48 p.m., which was a specific feeling she was not going to describe to the man sitting across from her in a diner in Eastern Caldwell. You should know, she said, that the conduct report Marsh filed is going to go to a formal review board. If that review results in a censure or license action, I'm going to contest it. I have documentation. What kind of documentation? Time-stamped ultrasound images from the Bayes system, the electronic monitor record, my own charting from the 22 minutes before the attending ordered the abdominal exploration. It's all in the system. Something sharpened in his eyes. You anticipated you'd need it. She picked up her coffee again. I've been in rooms where being right wasn't enough before. He nodded slowly. He seemed to be making a decision about something. Don't let anyone tell you to surrender that documentation, he said. Don't accept any settlement that requires you to waive future claims. And if anyone from hospital administration contacts you in the next 72 hours asking you to sign anything, I'm not signing anything, she said. Good. She finished her coffee. He hadn't touched his in several minutes. Outside, the blue-gray sky had gone fully dark. Is Marcus Hale going to survive? She asked. His surgeon says his prognosis is good. A brief hesitation. The surgeon being the one who operated, not the one who initially missed the injury. Marsh did the surgery? He did. He's apparently very good in the OR. Another of those compressed almost expressions. The investigation will determine the rest. She slid out of the booth. He stood again. One more thing, she said. The file you said you read, under the name that isn't Nora Voss. She met his eyes. Whatever's in it, I left that behind for a reason. I'd like it to stay that way. He looked at her for a moment. That's your call to make, Ms. Voss, not mine. She nodded once and walked out into the night. The next morning, she woke at 5:50 without an alarm, which was what her body did regardless of circumstances. She made coffee, stood at her kitchen window, and looked at the street below. A residential block in Caldwell's near west side, old trees, parked cars, a dog being walked by a man who never seemed to vary his route by more than half a block. She had chosen this apartment 2 years ago for the same reason she had chosen Caldwell and Heron Valley, and the particular version of invisibility she'd been maintaining since she separated. It was quiet, it was stable, and nobody asked questions she didn't want to answer. She called her union rep at 7 a.m. His name was Frank Adler, a former OR tech who had moved into labor relations 10 years ago with the resigned energy of someone who had seen enough administrative misconduct to have stopped being surprised by it and had decided that surprise was an inefficient use of time. I've already got the conduct report, he said when she identified herself. Marcia's office emailed it last night. When's the review? They've scheduled it for Friday, which is fast, by the way, faster than standard. Someone pushed this up the calendar. Marsh. Or someone above Marsh. Frank paused. Nora, the report characterizes what you did as a pattern of insubordination. He's specifically citing the ultrasound exam as unauthorized and the verbal challenges as disruptive to patient care. She was quiet. He's saying you disrupted patient care, she said, while the patient was actively hemorrhaging from an injury he hadn't found. I know what the clinical reality is. The review board may also know. The problem is what the official record currently shows. The official record in the EMR shows a fast exam initiated at 8:22, findings documented in my nursing notes, vital sign log showing BP decline consistent with ongoing hemorrhage, and a surgical exploration ordered at 8:31 that confirmed the abdominal source. The record shows everything. Then we bring the record, Frank said. Don't delete anything. Don't request alterations. Don't touch anything in that system. I know. Is there anything else I should know going into Friday? She thought about the diner. She thought about Colonel Daniel Reeves and the folder with the photograph, and the phrase, "the file we have on you under a different name." She thought about how much of that was relevant to a nursing conduct review, and how much of it was the beginning of something considerably larger. "Not yet," she said. She spent the morning at her kitchen table with her laptop, pulling her own documentation, the notes she'd entered in the EMR during the trauma, the timestamps embedded in the ultrasound system's image files, the vital sign log she'd requested a copy of through the employee portal before her access had been suspended at end of shift. The portal had still processed the request. She printed everything. The stack of paper on her table was 7 pages. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was a time-stamped, cross-referenced, clinically documented account of what had happened in Trauma Bay 1 from 8:15 to 8:31 on a Tuesday morning, and every page of it said the same thing in a different way. She had been right, and she had been right before anyone with more authority than her had been willing to accept it. She put the stack in a folder and made 2 copies. At noon, her phone rang again. Different unknown number, local this time. "Ms. Voss, this is Patricia Garland from the office of the Chief Medical Officer at Heron Valley." Smooth voice, administrative cadence, the kind of careful enunciation that comes from a job that involves delivering news other people don't want to hear. "I'm reaching out to let you know that the formal review scheduled for Friday will also involve a review of your nursing licensure status, in accordance with hospital policy regarding conduct actions of this nature." Nora's hand tightened slightly on the phone. "Licensure review," she said. "On what grounds?" The conduct report filed by Dr. Marsh characterizes the events in the trauma bay as involving unauthorized medical intervention beyond your scope of practice. "I performed a FAST exam. That's within nursing scope in an emergency trauma setting under standing orders. The standing orders in question are being reviewed as part of the overall process." "Ms. Garland," Nora kept her voice level, "I'm going to make sure you have something in writing before Friday. My union rep will be in contact." "Of course," Patricia Garland said. "We're committed to a thorough and fair process." She hung up. For a moment, she just stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand. The licensure threat was a different order of magnitude than a conduct report. A conduct report was documentation of a dispute. A licensure review could end her career in nursing entirely, not just at Heron Valley. It could follow her anywhere in the country. That was what it was designed to do. That was why it had been added. She called Frank back. "They're going after the license," she said when he picked up. A brief silence. "That escalated faster than I expected. They're claiming unauthorized medical intervention beyond scope of practice. They're trying to end this before it gets to a hearing," Frank said. "If you don't have standing as a licensed nurse, your documentation doesn't carry the same weight. Then we make sure Friday doesn't go the way they're planning. I'm going to need everything you have, tonight if possible. I'll email it within the hour." She went back to the table, scanned the documents, sent them to Frank, and then sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table and the stack of copied papers in front of her. The apartment was very quiet. The street below was unremarkable. She thought about a different kind of room, a forward operating base in a country she was not going to name, a tent that served as a trauma station, sand everywhere, heat that was a physical weight on every surface, and a man on a stretcher with injuries that the initial assessment had missed because initial assessments happen fast and under fire, and the person doing them had been awake for 19 hours. She had been the one who stayed, the one who looked again, the one who said there's something else when everyone else had moved on to the next problem. Some things didn't change across contexts. The difference was that in that tent, no one had filed a conduct report. By Thursday, the situation at Heron Valley had become something other than a personnel matter. She didn't know this at first. She knew only what she could observe from the outside. A call from Frank telling her that the hospital's legal team had requested a continuance on the Friday review, which he had declined to agree to. A text from a colleague named Waverly Dunn, one of the day shift nurses she occasionally had lunch with, saying simply, "People are talking here, heads up." And a second call from an unknown number that she picked up and listened to for approximately 4 seconds before recognizing the ambient sound quality of a large open office and hanging up. What she didn't know was that on Wednesday evening, 2 men in plainclothes had visited the medical records department at Heron Valley and requested access to surgical documentation for several cases over the preceding 18 months. The request had come with federal credentials. The records coordinator, a woman named Donna, who had worked in that department for 9 years, had later told her supervisor that she had processed stranger requests, and also scarier ones, but never one that was both at the same time. She didn't know that Marcus Hale, on Wednesday afternoon, had asked the attending physician overseeing his recovery for a writing pad, that he had spent 3 hours writing on it, that the pages, when collected by the man sitting in the chair by the window, had been photographed and transmitted within the hour. What she knew was that Thursday morning brought a knock on her apartment door at 9:17 a.m. She looked through the peephole. A woman, 30s, compact, dark jacket, the specific kind of comfortable professional shoes that spoke to a job that involved being on your feet, in circumstances that didn't permit you to be distracted by footwear. She was holding credentials up to the peephole with the patient efficiency of someone who had done this before. Nora opened the door. "Special Agent Tamara Briggs," the woman said. "FBI, Portland Field Office. Are you Nora Voss?" "I am." "Can I come in?" Nora stepped back from the door. Briggs entered the apartment with the unself-conscious assessment that law enforcement brought to new spaces. Not intrusive, just present, cataloging without making a production of it. She accepted the offer of a seat at the kitchen table. She declined coffee. "I'm going to be direct with you," she said, "because I think you'd prefer that." "I would." "We've been investigating Dr. Garrett Marsh for approximately 7 months. She set a file on the table between them but didn't open it. The investigation began as a financial review, specifically irregular billing patterns in his surgical department. Over time, it expanded. We found evidence of falsified surgical outcomes in at least 6 cases over the past 3 years. We found a pattern of record alteration following cases where complications were documented. And we found— She paused. "We found a connection between Dr. Marsh and a small group of individuals with a sustained interest in the outcomes of specific federal employees who have been treated at Heron Valley." Nora looked at the file on the table. "Specific federal employees," she said, "like Marcus Hale." Marcus Hale came to Heron Valley because he was the nearest major trauma center to the crash site. That wasn't planned by anyone. It was an accident of geography. Briggs leaned forward slightly. "What we believe happened, and I want to be clear that we're still building the case, is that once Hale arrived at Heron Valley and was identified, certain parties were notified, and that those parties had an existing relationship with Dr. Marsh that involved, at minimum, the exchange of information about certain patients." The kitchen was very still. "He wasn't just incompetent," Nora said. "He knew. We believe he was informed of Hale's identity shortly after intake. We believe he made the decision to prioritize the chest, which would not have been immediately fatal, over the abdomen, which would. He let him bleed." Briggs didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She held Nora's gaze and let the silence make the statement for her. "Why are you here?" Nora said. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Dr. Marsh filed a conduct report and initiated a licensure review against you. Because the documentation you created during that trauma, timestamps, imaging, monitoring records, is material evidence in a federal investigation. And because we need you to understand that what you're holding is not just your defense in a nursing review." Briggs touched the edge of the file on the table. "It's evidence of an attempted murder that was almost disguised as a surgical complication." Nora sat very still. Outside, she could hear the dog-walking man passing below the window, the click of nails on pavement, the ordinary texture of a Thursday morning in a residential neighborhood. "He changed the records," she said. "He began altering the surgical documentation on Wednesday. We caught it because we'd already flagged the file for monitoring." Something shifted in Briggs's expression. Not satisfaction, more like the grim confirmation of something she'd expected. "He's been doing it for a long time. He's very good at it, but he's never had to do it while we were watching." Nora looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the conduct report, the licensure review. Patricia Garland's smooth administrative voice. "We're committed to a thorough and fair process." She thought about the way Marsh had moved her aside in the trauma bay. That efficient, dismissive physical adjustment, the way you'd move a piece of equipment that was in the wrong place. "What do you need from me?" she said. "We need a formal statement. We need your documentation preserved under chain of custody. And we need you to not sign anything, accept any settlement, or agree to any administrative resolution that includes a confidentiality clause." Briggs met her eyes directly. "We're close. But this needs to go all the way. And if you get quietly settled out of the picture, we lose a key thread." Nora nodded. "My union rep already told me not to sign anything." Good. Your union rep is right. Briggs stood and Nora stood with her. One more thing. The administrative leave, the licensure review. We're going to be in contact with the Oregon State Board of Nursing. They'll receive a federal hold notification on any action against your license pending the outcome of our investigation. That doesn't guarantee what happens on the other side of all this, but it prevents anything irreversible from happening before the truth is established. She extended her hand. Nora shook it. At the door, Briggs paused. The man you saved, she said. He's awake. He's been asking about you. She looked at Nora with an expression that was harder to read than the rest of the conversation had been. He said to tell you, and I'm quoting because I didn't fully understand the reference, that he knew someone would recognize it. Nora's hand was on the door. She held it there. Recognize what? She said. Briggs shook her head. He said you'd know. She left. Nora stood in the open doorway for a moment, her hand still on the door, looking at the empty hallway. The building was quiet. Somewhere below, the dog-walking man had completed his route and gone home. The Thursday morning, unremarkable city went about its business. He said you'd know. She did know. She didn't want to, but she did. Because there was one detail she had not included in her formal documentation, had not mentioned to Frank, or to Sandra Price, or to Colonel Reeves in the diner. A detail that had existed on the edges of her clinical assessment in Trauma Bay 1. And that she had processed and set aside with the same deliberateness with which she set everything aside. The discipline of compartmentalization that had been trained into her and that she had continued to practice long after she stopped needing to. Marcus Hale had a scar. Left lateral abdomen, between the 8th and 9th rib, slightly below the site where she'd identified the free fluid. The scar was old, at least 5 years, she estimated, and it had the specific character of a wound that had been closed under field conditions rather than in an OR. She had seen that kind of scar before. She had been present when a scar like that was made. Not on Marcus Hale. On a different man, a different country, a different year, but the same network she'd been part of, the same circles. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen table. She went back in and picked it up. Unknown number, military area code. She picked up. Ms. Voss? A voice she didn't recognize, young, male, slightly strained with the effort of staying professional over something that was clearly not a routine call. I'm Specialist Darren Okafor, administrative aide to Colonel Reeves. He asked me to call you with an update. Go ahead. Marcus Hale's medical file has been pulled by federal investigators. Dr. Marsh attempted to access and alter the surgical record this morning at 7:44 a.m. A breath. He was arrested at 8:15. He's currently in federal custody. The words landed with a weight that was different from the weight of the conversation with Briggs, different from the morning in the trauma bay, different from all of it. She sat down at the kitchen table because her legs had decided without consulting her that standing was unnecessary. His access to the hospital has been revoked, Okafor continued. The hospital board has been notified. A federal warrant is being executed at the hospital and at his residence simultaneously. She didn't say anything. Colonel Reeves wanted you to know, Okafor said, before you heard it from anywhere else. Thank you, she said. She hung up. The 7 pages of documentation sat in their folder on the corner of her table. The 2 copies were in a drawer. Outside, a car turned slowly down her street, its engine a low sound that faded as it passed. She thought about Marsh in handcuffs. She tried to locate something definitive in herself about that. Satisfaction, maybe, or relief, and found something more complicated. Something that was partly those things, and partly the specific exhaustion of being right in a situation where being right was not the end of anything, only the beginning. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the number was Frank Adler's. Did you hear? He said when she answered. I just heard. The licensure review has been suspended. I got a call from the board 3 minutes ago. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, something like disbelief. The disbelief of a man who had spent 10 years in labor relations, learning not to expect things to go right, confronting an instance of them going right. Nora, whatever was going on at that hospital, it's bigger than a conduct report. I know, she said. Are you okay? She thought about that honestly, the way she thought about most things, directly, without softening. Ask me in a few days, she said. She put the phone down and sat at her kitchen table in the Thursday morning quiet. Garrett Marsh was in federal custody. Her license was protected, for now. Marcus Hale was awake in a room on the fourth floor of Heron Valley Medical Center, and he had sent her a message through an FBI agent that she understood and wished she didn't, because what it meant was that her careful, constructed, 2-year-old version of invisibility had just come apart at the seams. And somewhere in this city, in a network that had put a man in a car and aimed it at a federal operative and then tried to let him die on an operating table, there were other people who had not yet been arrested, people who knew that the plan had failed, people who also knew, now, that the nurse in Trauma Bay 1 was the reason why. She sat at that kitchen table for another 20 minutes without moving, which was not a thing she typically did. The problem with the conclusion she'd arrived at, that people connected to the network knew who she was, and that she was the reason their plan had failed, was that it wasn't a paranoid conclusion. It was a logical one. She had spent years in environments where the difference between paranoia and accurate threat assessment was the quality of your reasoning, and her reasoning here was sound. Marsh had made a call on the night of the crash, asking someone to find out who she was. That call had gone somewhere. The arrest had happened fast, which meant federal investigators had been close and watching, but fast didn't mean complete. Networks didn't collapse because one node got arrested. They contracted. They reassigned. She got up, went to her bedroom closet, and moved a box of off-season clothes to the left. Behind it was a smaller box, plain cardboard, taped shut. She'd moved it with her twice. She had never opened it in Caldwell. She didn't open it now. She put the clothes box back and stood in the closet doorway for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Reeves directly. He'd given her the number at the diner, handwritten on the back of a diner receipt, which she'd thought at the time was either a very analog gesture or a very deliberate one. He answered on the second ring. "I was going to call you," he said. "I need to know if I have exposure," she said. "Not professionally, personally." A pause that was longer than his usual pauses. "We're working on that assessment." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's not." Another pause, shorter. "There's a protective protocol we can put in place. It involves—" "I don't want protective protocol," she said. "I want to know if the people who put Hale in front of that car know that I'm the one who kept him alive." He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "We believe Marsh communicated your name before his arrest," Reeves said. "We don't know to whom. We don't know how far it traveled. That's honest." She absorbed that. "Okay," she said. "Nora." It was the first time he'd used her first name. It landed with a different weight than she expected. "I know you don't want protocol, but I need you to be somewhere that isn't your listed address for the next 48 hours while we trace the communication." She looked around her apartment. The kitchen table with the folder of documents. The window with the view of the street she'd chosen for its quietness. 2 years of careful ordinariness, assembled and maintained. "I'll figure it out," she said. "I'd prefer—" "I'll be in contact," she said, and hung up. She packed a bag in 11 minutes, which was more than she'd needed in other contexts, but appropriate for this one. She left the folder of documents. She'd already sent the digital copies to Frank, to Briggs, to her own encrypted backup. She took the cardboard box from the closet. She texted Frank a single line. "Will be unreachable for 48 AHRs. Don't agree to anything." She texted Waverly Dunn. "Laying low. Everything okay." She did not text anyone else because there was no one else to text, which was a fact about her life that she carried with the same calibration she carried everything else. Acknowledged, accepted, filed. She drove to a motel on the Route 9 corridor, 8 miles east of her apartment, the kind of place that took cask for a second form of ID, if the first one was presented with sufficient confidence. She paid for 2 nights. She brought the box inside and set it on the particle board dresser and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. Then she opened it. The contents were not dramatic. No weapons, nothing classified, nothing that would mean anything to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. A set of medical credentials under a different name, not Nora Voss. A challenge coin from a unit that had been officially decommissioned in 2019. A folded photograph she didn't look at directly, just registered its presence and moved past it. A small notebook with handwritten clinical notes from cases that existed nowhere in any civilian system. And a personnel ID card, laminated, with her photograph and a rank designation and a unit identifier. She held it by the edges and looked at her own face looking back at her. 27 in that photograph. The year before she'd separated. The photograph had been taken at a base in a location she was not going to specify even in her own internal narration, and she had been in the middle of something when it was taken. She could tell by the specific quality of her expression, the not quite present look of someone whose mind was already 3 problems ahead of where their body was standing. Staff Sergeant Nora Voss, combat medical specialist, attached to a Joint Special Operations Evacuation Unit, had treated casualties in 4 countries over 6 years, and had twice been formally recognized for decisions made under fire that had preserved lives when standard protocols had been inadequate to the conditions. She had separated honorably, for reasons that were her own, and that she had never fully explained to anyone and did not intend to. She had rebuilt herself as a civilian nurse with the same systematic deliberateness with which she'd once planned extraction routes, identifying the objective, removing obstacles, executing without drawing attention. She put the ID card back in the box and closed it. Knowing who she was didn't change what was currently happening, but it clarified something about the stakes, about why the message Hale had sent through Briggs had landed the way it did. He knew you'd recognize it. The scar, yes, but also the broader recognition. Someone from that world, even the edges of it, could read her in the trauma bay the way a musician could recognize technique in someone else's performance, regardless of the stage. Her phone buzzed. Frank. Board of Nursing confirmed federal hold, review suspended indefinitely, hospital legal team requesting a meeting. Then, a moment later, I told them you're unavailable, which you are. Good timing. She put the phone down. She ordered food from a place 2 miles away that delivered and ate half of it at the particle board table while reviewing the documentation for what was probably the 4th time, not because she expected to find something new, but because it steadied her, the way any systematic task steadied her, the discipline of moving through known material with precision. At 11 p.m., she turned the lights off and lay on top of the motel bedspread and stared at the ceiling and thought about Marcus Hale's face in the trauma bay. Ashen, unconscious, jaw set, with the autonomic resistance of a body that hadn't decided to give up yet. She thought about the monitor alarm changing pitch. She thought about moving to the ultrasound without asking. She fell asleep around midnight, which was faster than she expected. The call came at 6:08 a.m. Reeves. His voice had a texture she hadn't heard from him before. Compressed, operational, stripped of everything that wasn't necessary. We've identified the communication chain, he said. Marsh made 2 calls before his arrest. One to his attorney, one to a number registered to a logistics company in Portland that is a documented front organization for the network we've been investigating. The content of that call was encrypted, but the metadata shows duration, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. That's enough time to say a name and a lot of other things. She was already sitting up. What does that mean for me? It means we've been tracking movement overnight that we don't like. 2 individuals connected to the network were in Caldwell as of last night. We don't know their specific objective, but given the timing, they're not here for the scenery. No, he said. I need you to stay where you are and not use your regular phone after this call. I'm going to send someone to your location. How do you know my location? A brief pause. Ms. Voss? Please? She almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale instead. How long? She asked. 90 minutes. Maybe less. His name is Rourke. He'll identify himself. She had 90 minutes, a motel room on Route 9, and 2 individuals of unknown specific intent somewhere in Caldwell who knew her name and probably her face from Marsh's description. She pulled her civilian phone SIM card, put it in the box, and spent the next 20 minutes doing the kind of environmental assessment that she'd thought she'd retired from doing permanently when she'd handed in her separation paperwork. The motel had 2 exits, main lobby and a rear fire door that opened onto a service lot. The service lot backed up to a tree line, beyond which Route 9 ran parallel for about a quarter mile before a service road connected back to the main highway. She wasn't going anywhere. She was just knowing the way she always knew, the way she couldn't entirely stop knowing. She made instant coffee from the motel room's complimentary packet, and it was terrible, and she drank it anyway. Rourke arrived at 7:41 a.m. He knocked 4 times, then once, then twice, which was not a code she'd been given, but was recognizable as deliberate patterning rather than incidental rhythm. She looked through the peephole. Male, late 30s, built practically rather than impressively, the kind of person whose physical presence registered as competent rather than threatening. Civilian clothes. The posture. She opened the door. "Rourke," he said. "Voss," she said. He came inside, assessed the room the same way she'd assessed the exits, and nodded once at the box on the dresser with the particular non-acknowledgement of someone who had seen what was in similar boxes and was not going to comment on it. The two individuals were identified at a gas station on the 9 corridor at 0530, he said. "They're in a rental. Oregon plates, but Portland registration. We have surveillance on them. They haven't moved since EO 600. "Where are they now?" He told her. It was 3 miles west of the motel. "They may be watching the hospital," he said, "in case you surface there." "I'm on administrative leave. I have no reason to go to the hospital." "People do things they have no official reason to do. They may not know about the leave." He sat in the room's only chair, which he did not adjust or angle, just used. "Colonel Reeves wants to move you to a secured location pending the operational resolution of the surveillance situation." "What's the timeline on that?" "Unknown." "I'm not going to a secured location for an unknown timeline," she said. "I have a license review to prepare for and a federal statement to give, and the federal statement can be given remotely." "Rourke." She used the same flat register she used when she wanted something to be clear without being aggressive. "I understand the concern. I'm not dismissing it. I'm telling you that disappearing into protective custody while Marsh is in federal processing and the hospital board is in crisis and the review board has a hold on my license is not something I'm willing to do. I need to be visible. I need to be accessible to my union rep and to Agent Briggs and to the state board. Disappearing makes me look like I have something to hide." He looked at her steadily. "It also keeps you alive," he said. "So does not acting like someone who needs to be hidden," she said. "I've been in situations where the worst thing you could do was let the other side see they'd put you on your heels." He thought about that for a moment, which she appreciated. He wasn't the kind of person who argued for the sake of it. "Compromise," he said. "You go to the hospital. I drive. I stay visible." "Deal," she said. She picked up the box. He looked at it. "You want to leave that here?" he said. "No," she said. Heron Valley Medical Center at 8:30 a.m. looked like a hospital that had received news. It was still processing. There were 2 vehicles she didn't recognize in the administrative lot, dark, unmarked, the particular nondescriptness that was its own kind of description. A cluster of 3 people near the main entrance who were not patients or staff, one of them with a phone to his ear and the focused nowhere gaze of someone conducting rather than receiving a call. In the lobby, the volunteer at the information desk was trying to answer 2 questions simultaneously from 2 different families, and behind her, the wall-mounted screen that normally displayed hospital news was showing a holding image that said technical difficulties. Rourke parked and got out with her, but positioned himself at the lobby entrance rather than following her inside, which was the right call. She went through the main doors. The charge nurse at the main desk was a man named Owen, who had worked day shifts at Heron Valley for 7 years, and whose primary quality was an unflappable practicality that tended to function as a structural support for everyone around him. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the complicated thing where several reactions competed briefly before settling on the one that was most immediately useful. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "I know. I need to see Agent Briggs. 2nd floor, conference room B. She's been there since 7. He paused. "Also, Marcus Hale's care team has been trying to reach you." "Why?" "He's been asking for you specifically, since last night. His attending says he's becoming—" Owen chose his words with the careful accuracy of someone who had learned that imprecision caused problems. "Persistent. I'll go up after Briggs." She took the stairs. 2nd floor conference room B had a temporary ID scanner on the door that had not been there 2 days ago, manned by a man in a dark jacket who checked her ID, confirmed her name against a list on a tablet, and let her through without saying anything else. The conference room had been converted into something that was not quite a command post and not quite an interview room, but had properties of both. Briggs was at the head of the table with 2 other people Nora didn't recognize. Laptops, cables, a whiteboard with a map of Caldwell on it that had several locations circled in red marker. Briggs looked up. "I heard you were in the building," she said. "Good. I was going to send someone for you." She gestured to a chair. "Sit down. We need to cover the formal statement today. We can't wait." "There are 2 people from the network surveilling this building," Nora said. "We know." We're managing that. Briggs said it with the specific calm of someone who actually meant it, rather than using it as a deflection. We have eyes on them. They're not going to move on anything with this level of federal presence in the building. She paused. They're probably here for information, not action, trying to assess the situation. What's the situation to assess? Whether their window is still open. Briggs looked at her. Hale is alive and talking. Marsh is in custody and talking. He hasn't invoked yet, which means he's scared enough to cooperate, or calculating enough to think cooperation helps him, and either way, it's useful to us. The network knows their operation failed. The question for them is whether it failed completely or whether there are still loose ends. Loose ends like Hale, Nora said. Hale, yes, and the documentation trail. And anyone who can corroborate the chain of events inside this hospital. Briggs looked at her with the direct, undecorated gaze of someone delivering information without editorial, which includes you. Nora sat down. The statement took 2 hours and 14 minutes. She gave it with the same precision she brought to clinical documentation. Specific, sequential, sourced to observable evidence rather than interpretation, with clear delineation between what she had directly observed and what she had inferred. Briggs asked good questions. The two other agents asked sharper ones. At one point, a man she hadn't noticed in the corner of the room looked up from his laptop and said, "The ultrasound timestamp, 8:22. Can you confirm that's when you initiated the exam, not when you documented it?" And she said yes, she could confirm it because the system logged initiation automatically on probe contact, and the documentation timestamp was 8:24, 2 minutes after first image acquisition. The man nodded and went back to his laptop. At 10:47, Briggs called a break, and they got coffee from a cart that someone had wheeled into the hallway. Nora stood at the window at the end of the corridor and looked down at the parking lot. She could see Rourke near the entrance, exactly where she'd left him. She could see one of the unmarked vehicles she'd clocked on arrival. She could see, at the far edge of the lot, a gray rental car that had been parked there since before she arrived. She could not see the occupants, but the car hadn't moved. At 11:15, she went up to the 4th floor. The man in the civilian clothes chair was still outside Hale's room, but there was a second man now, at the end of the corridor. She checked in at the nurse's station, where a travel nurse named Petra confirmed that Hale's vitals were stable and his pain was managed, and he'd refused a sedative 3 times since the night before. "He keeps asking for the nurse from the trauma bay," Petra said. "The one who spotted the abdominal bleed. Apparently, one of the federal people told him you were in the building." "That's me," Nora said. Petra looked at her with an expression that was partly curiosity and partly relief. "Room 412. He's been awake since about 6. She knocked. "Come in," he said. His voice was low, rougher than it would normally be. The rasp of intubation and 2 days of recovery. But steady. She pushed the door open. Marcus Hale in a hospital bed looked considerably different from Marcus Hale on the trauma gurney, and not only because he was conscious. He had the kind of physical presence that registered clearly even in a hospital gown with 2 IV lines and a drain, not size exactly, more density, like someone who occupied space with deliberate efficiency. His face had color now, though not full color. He tracked her immediately when she entered, the way people tracked movement when they were trained to, and his eyes held a quality that she recognized from her own when she looked in the mirror, the specific focus of someone whose attention was not divided. "Voss," he said. She stopped just inside the door. "Hale. You look like someone who's been managing a crisis." "Little bit," she said. She came further into the room, didn't sit, stood at a comfortable distance at the right side of the bed. "How's the pain?" "Manageable. The drain is the annoying part." He shifted slightly. "They told me you figured it out in 22 minutes. Closer to 15? I just documented it at 22. Something crossed his face. "You didn't ask to be thanked." "No." "But you're here. You asked for me specifically enough that it went through 2 federal agents and a travel nurse." He looked at her steadily. Then he said, "You saw the scar." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Cascade Unit 2016-2018, Joint Medevac, multi-agency. You wouldn't have been direct unit, but you'd have been in the operational vicinity." He paused. "I remembered a name from an after-action briefing, not a face, but in the trauma bay, when I was drifting. I could tell by how you moved. You were barely conscious. I was conscious enough. He looked at the window. I knew if someone from that kind of background was in that room, they'd see what the surgeon missed. I was trying to hold on long enough. Nora was quiet for a moment. That's a significant amount of trust to place in a partial memory and a movement pattern, she said. I didn't have a lot of options. She looked at his chart on the wall-mounted panel. Post-op day 2, splenectomy, hepatic repair, hemoglobin trending up. No fever. His body was doing what it was supposed to do, which was recover. Reeves told me you've been talking, she said, giving them everything I have. His jaw tightened slightly. The network I was investigating. I've been building the documentation for 18 months. The crash wasn't random. They knew I was getting close. Marsh was one of their assets. He was their safety net inside the hospital. If any of their people came through trauma with injuries that could be managed, he was the one who managed it. Something cold entered his expression. In both directions. Making sure the right people survived. Making sure the wrong ones didn't. The room was very still. How many? She said. We think at least 4 deaths over the past 3 years that were coded as surgical complications. He looked at her directly. That's what your documentation blew open. Not just what happened to me. The pattern. She thought about the 7 pages in the folder. The timestamps, the vital signs, the ultrasound images. The small, precise record of 22 minutes in a trauma bay. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it. The 2 people in the parking lot, she said. They're here because the network knows the operation failed. They're assessing. And they know you were the variable they didn't account for. Yes. Hale looked at her with an expression that was not pitying and not alarmed and not performatively calm. It was just direct, the way everything about him was direct, and what it communicated was a specific kind of recognition, one professional to another, stripped of rank and context, which was the only kind that mattered. What are you going to do? He said. What I came here to do, she said. Give the statement, preserve the documentation, make sure the board review goes the right way. That's not what I meant. She met his eyes. I know. The phone buzzed again. She looked at it this time. Rourke. A text, 3 words. Gray car moved. She looked up. Hale was watching her face read the message and read her reading it with the same facility she had. They're moving, she said. He started to push himself upright, and she put a hand on his arm without thinking about it. The automatic clinical gesture of someone who had spent a decade making sure patients didn't dislodge their lines. Stay, she said. Voss, you have 2 IVs and a drain and you're 48 hours post-op, she said. Stay. She went to the door. The man in the chair outside was already on his phone, upright, alert. Down the corridor, the second man was moving toward the elevator. She could feel the shift in the building's operational texture. The subtle, system-wide change that happened when a situation that had been static started moving. Her phone rang. Briggs. The gray car left the lot, Briggs said. We have a tail on it, but it moved fast. I need you to stay on 4. I'm on 4. I mean in the room. I heard you. She went back inside. Hale had not tried to sit up again, which she respected. He looked at her when she came back in. They're running, she said. Or repositioning. Outside the window, she could see the edge of the parking lot from this angle. The gray car's space was empty. Rourke was on his phone scanning. 2 more people she didn't recognize were moving toward the building entrance in a way that suggested urgency without performing it. Then the hospital's intercom clicked on. Not a code. Not a page. A system-wide announcement in the flat, practiced register of hospital administration. The kind of voice that delivered news in a tone calibrated to prevent panic precisely because the news being delivered had the potential to cause it. Attention all staff. This is a facility security notification. All non-essential personnel are asked to move away from exterior windows and remain in their current location until further notice. Security teams are responding to an incident in the hospital's east parking structure. Thank you for your cooperation. Hale looked at her. She looked at the window. The east parking structure was directly adjacent to the 4th floor's exterior corridor. The corridor she'd just walked through. Her phone rang again. Not Briggs. Not Rourke. Unknown number. She picked it up. Silence on the line for 1 second. Then a voice she did not recognize, male, unhurried in a way that was its own kind of threat. Sergeant Voss, the voice said, we'd like to have a conversation. She did not respond immediately. That was the first thing. The discipline of not filling silence with sound just because silence felt dangerous. She had learned that a long time ago, in a context that had nothing to do with hospital corridors and everything to do with the specific value of making the other person reveal their next move before you revealed yours. The voice waited. She counted 3 seconds. "You have the wrong number," she said, and hung up. She immediately called Briggs. "Someone just called me on an unknown number and used my military rank," she said when Briggs picked up. Male voice, calm, no regional accent I could place. He said they wanted to have a conversation. A half-second of silence on Briggs's end that contained a significant amount of information. "Don't move from that room. I'm sending someone up now." The call came in while the announcement was going out. They timed it. "I know." Briggs's voice had tightened. "The incident in the east parking structure. We have a man down. Security guard. He's alive, but they got past him, which means they had building access that they shouldn't have." A brief pause that Nora understood to mean Briggs was moving while talking. "Stay with Hale. Do not open the door for anyone who doesn't identify with the word Meridian. That's today's confirmation code. Repeat it back." "Meridian," Nora said. The call ended. Hale had heard enough of her side of the conversation to understand the shape of it. He looked at her with the focused, unhurried attention of someone doing rapid threat calculus, and she could see him arrive at the same conclusion she had, that the phone call was not an actual attempt at conversation. It was a locator, a confirmation that she was in the building, on her phone, in this room. "They know where we are," he said. "They knew before the call," she said. "The call was to see if I'd panic and move." She went to the door and looked through the narrow, reinforced glass panel. The corridor was clear except for the man who had been stationed there, now visibly alert rather than watchfully passive, hand near his jacket, phone to his ear. At the far end, the second man was physically blocking the elevator, palm up, stopping a transport aide who was trying to move a linen cart with the reasonable confusion of someone who had not been briefed on why their Tuesday had become complicated. She came back in. She did not lock the door from the inside because a locked door announced itself. She stood where she could see the door panel without being directly in the sight line of anyone entering. Hale said, "There's a call button on my bed rail." "I know. I can create noise if you need a distraction. I'm hoping we don't need that." "Me too," he said, "but I'm flagging it." 3 minutes passed. They were long minutes. Not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening was invisible. The operational movement of people through a building, the tightening of a perimeter, decisions being made in corridors and stairwells that would determine how the next 10 minutes went. Nora stood with her back to the wall between the door and the window, not rigid, just positioned. Her breathing was even. Her mind was doing the thing it did in high-pressure situations, which was not calm exactly, but a kind of compressed clarity. Everything irrelevant dropping away, everything relevant sharpening. Someone knocked. 3 times. Pause. Once. Pause. Twice. She looked at Hale. He gave a slight nod. She opened the door. "Rourke." He came in fast and pulled the door mostly shut behind him. "We have them on camera in the stairwell," he said. 2 individuals, east stairwell, currently between 3 and 4. Building security and our people are converging. You need to stay in this room." "They're going to know this is the room," Nora said. "Hale's name is on the door panel." Rourke looked at her. He had the expression of someone who had just registered a problem that should have been addressed 4 hours ago and was making rapid peace with that. "I'll get a team member posted directly outside." "Do that." He moved back to the door. "Rourke," she said. He stopped. The voice on the phone. "Did it match anything in your surveillance database?" "We're running it." He looked at her steadily. "Meridian," he added, and was gone. The door clicked shut. She looked at Hale. "You should get behind the bed," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite indignation, more like the specific resistance of someone who had spent years being the one people positioned behind things rather than in front of them. "I have a drain." "I know. Move carefully." He moved, not quickly and not without discomfort. She could see the effort it cost him, the way he held his right side and leveraged himself without allowing the drain line to pull. But he did it, shifting to the far side of the bed, so the mattress and frame were between him and the door. She remained where she was. The next 6 minutes were the kind of minutes that didn't announce themselves. No dramatic sounds from the corridor, no shouting. What she heard instead was a series of small auditory signals that her trained attention decoded without effort. Two sets of footsteps moving fast outside, the staticky blip of a radio squelch, a brief sharp exchange of voices that was cut off quickly, and then, unmistakably, the sound of a body weight being controlled against a wall, the specific thud of physical restraint done by someone who knew how to do it. Then nothing. Then Rourke's knock sequence again. She opened the door. "We have them," he said. His jacket was dusty at the shoulder. "Both of them. East stairwell, third floor landing. They're in custody." She exhaled once. "Anyone hurt?" "The team member on the third floor landing has a cut on his forearm, non-critical." Rourke looked at her with something that was not quite relief but occupied similar territory. They had hospital staff ID badges, fabricated but good quality. They'd been inside the building since approximately 0700, before the federal agents arrived, before Nora had come through the front entrance. They had been in the building the entire time she'd been giving her statement 2 floors below. She processed that. "Marcia's network," she said, "almost certainly. We'll know more once they're processed." He paused. "They're not going to talk. These people are trained not to. But the badges, the access pattern, it's all evidence and it builds the case." He looked past her to where Hale had resettled himself against the bed, now sitting on the floor with his back against the frame and the expression of a man who was too tired to be embarrassed about it. "Hale," Rourke said, "you good?" "Terrific," Hale said. "Outback." By mid-afternoon, Heron Valley Medical Center had the layered, exhausted quality of a place that had been a crisis location and was now beginning the slow process of returning to being a hospital. Federal vehicles were still in the lot, but the cluster at the entrance had thinned. Conference Room B on the second floor had been converted from operational hub back towards something more administrative as the immediate security situation resolved, and the longer, slower work of legal and investigative process took over. Nora sat in a chair in the corridor outside room 412, not because she had been told to, but because the room needed the space and she needed something she could only get by not being inside. She had her phone and a cup of coffee that had come from the staff break room 2 floors down and was better than the motel's complimentary packet, which was not a high bar. She was reading a text from Frank Adler. It was long for Frank. He had forwarded her an email from the hospital's legal team that had arrived at 1:47 p.m., addressed jointly to Frank and to the Oregon State Board of Nursing and to Agent Briggs. The email was 3 paragraphs and formally worded, the way emails were formally worded when the people writing them had lawyers looking over their shoulders. It stated that in light of ongoing federal investigation, Heron Valley Medical Center was withdrawing the conduct report filed against Nora Voss. It stated that the hospital recognized the nursing care provided on the morning in question as within scope and consistent with best practice. It stated that Ms. Voss's administrative leave was rescinded effective immediately, and her employment record would reflect no adverse action. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her lap and looked at the corridor wall, which was the particular shade of off-white that hospital walls were universally painted, presumably because it was both unoffensive and cleanable. The email was not an apology. It was a legal positioning document. She knew that, and it mattered. And it also mattered that it existed, that it was now in a federal agent's inbox and a union rep's inbox and a state board file. The document that had been meant to end her professional credibility now occupied the same folder as the document dismantling itself. She sent Frank a reply. Acknowledged. Don't respond yet. Let me know if anything else comes in. Then she sat with the coffee and thought about the 4 patients Briggs had mentioned. 4 deaths over 3 years coded as surgical complications. 4 families who had received explanations that were fabricated. She thought about them in the way she usually thought about things that were large and hard, not trying to process all of it at once, because that was not how processing worked, but letting it land in full weight without softening it. At 3:15, Briggs came up to the 4th floor. She sat down in the chair next to Nora in the corridor with the energy of someone who had been operational since before dawn and was drawing on reserves now. "The 2 men from the stairwell," she said. "One of them had a phone on him, encrypted, but our tech team has tools for that. We're in." "What did you find?" "Communication with a third party in the 24 hours before today. The third party's number traces to a payphone in Portland, which is theatrically old school and also genuinely difficult to trace. But the content of the messages, Briggs paused, and Nora could see her deciding how much to say and arriving at all of it. The messages reference a specific patient file. They reference Marsh by name, and they reference the liability from the trauma bay, that's you, as a priority concern. Priority concern, Nora said. Meaning they wanted to know if you'd been neutralized. The administrative action against you was supposed to handle it. When that started coming apart, when Marsh was arrested, the priority classification changed. To what? Briggs looked at her directly. To containment. The word sat in the corridor air with its full implication. They weren't here to have a conversation, Nora said. The phone call was an assessment. If you'd engaged, if you'd tried to negotiate or ask what they wanted or agreed to meet them, that would have told them you were operating alone. As a civilian. Briggs paused. The fact that you hung up and immediately activated your federal contacts told them something different. It told them I wasn't operating alone. It told them the window was closed. Briggs sat back. They were moving to cut losses, and the arrest in the stairwell completed that. The network is going to go dark now. Pull back, destroy evidence, relocate assets. That's what these organizations do when an operation fails at this level. She looked at Nora. Which means we need to move fast on the financial documentation and the surgical records before they do. Marsh's cooperation. He's been talking since 9 a.m. Something in Briggs' expression said the talking had been extensive and consequential. He retained counsel at 7, fired them by 8:30, and is currently in a room with a prosecutor and a recorder. He's giving us names. He's giving us transaction records. He's given us the methodology for the record alterations across 4 cases. She paused. He's also confirmed that the decision not to prioritize the abdominal injury in Hale's case was not an oversight. The corridor was very quiet. He confirmed it was intentional, Nora said. He said he was told Hale's identity within 10 minutes of intake. He said the instruction he received was to manage the outcome. Briggs' voice was flat and clinical, the way voices got when the content they were delivering was too significant to decorate. He made the determination to focus on the less critical injury and allow the hemorrhage to proceed. Nora looked at the opposite wall. She thought about 8:22 a.m. The probe against the abdomen. The image on the screen, unmistakable. The decision to say something in a room where saying something was professionally dangerous. She thought about what would have happened if she'd looked away. He's going to give you what you need, she said. He's giving us more than we need, Briggs said. The 4 previous cases. He's walked us through each one. 2 of the patients were federal employees. 1 was a witness in an unrelated financial fraud case who was hospitalized after a car accident. 1 was a prosecutor. She stopped. The network used him as an instrument for 7 years. Did he know what he was part of? Briggs looked at her steadily. He says he thought it was limited, that he was only providing information, managing records, that the first death was presented to him as a necessary exception. He says it escalated in ways he didn't anticipate, and by the time he understood the scope, he was too far in. Do you believe him? I believe it's possible, Briggs said. I also believe it doesn't matter. He made the choice every time. 7 years of choices. She stood up. He's going to spend the rest of his career in a federal institution, and the people whose families deserve the truth are going to get it. That's what matters now. She went back to the elevator. Nora sat with the second cup of coffee that a nurse named Petra had brought her without being asked, because Petra had apparently decided that Nora was part of the 4th floor's operational reality and should be caffeinated accordingly. She sat with it and looked at her phone and thought about 4 families and 4 fabricated explanations and the 7-year wait of a man who had made a choice and then made it again. Her phone showed a missed call from Sandra Price. She called back. Sandra answered on the first ring, which suggested she had been watching her phone. I heard about the withdrawal, Sandra said, of the conduct report. I just read it. Nora, I want to... Sandra stopped, started again. I should have pushed back harder when they put the leave through. I knew the clinical record didn't support it. You did what you could in the system you were working in, Nora said. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one. She meant it. Sandra had been navigating a structure in which a surgeon with 16 years of board relationships had significantly more gravitational pull than a floor nurse on administrative leave. That was a real constraint. Pretending it wasn't didn't help anyone understand how these situations happened and kept happening. Are you still charge supervisor? Yes? Then when I come back, we should talk about the standing orders for fast exams in trauma. They should be clearer. They weren't the reason Marsh acted the way he did, but they're the reason he had a credible argument about scope. A pause on Sandra's end. You want to fix the protocol that was used against you. I want the next nurse who sees something in that bay to have clearer standing for saying so, Nora said. The patient doesn't care about the politics. Another pause. When Sandra spoke again, her voice had a quality that was hard to name precisely. Something like the specific relief of a person who had been braced for anger and received something else. I'll set up a meeting with the department head. When you're ready. She did not go back to the motel that night. Rourke had driven her back to her apartment at 5:30, checked the building, confirmed it was clear, and stood in her kitchen while she made actual food for the first time in 2 days. Pasta, nothing elaborate, the kind of meal that was about having something warm and unremarkable rather than nutrition specifically. He accepted a bowl without being asked and ate at her kitchen table with the unself-conscious practicality of someone who had learned not to turn down food during operational periods. What happens now? She said. For the investigation, warrants are being executed in Portland tonight. 3 addresses connected to the network. The 2 individuals in custody will be processed and charged. Marsh's cooperation will either result in a plea arrangement or a trial, depending on what the prosecutor decides. He looked at his bowl. It moves into the system. That's always slower. And for me, your administrative status is cleared. Your license has no action pending. He looked up. You could go back to work tomorrow if you wanted to. She thought about that. I'll go back Friday, she said. Give the board time to process the formal reinstatement paperwork. He nodded. They ate. Outside, Caldwell's residential street was doing its ordinary evening things. A car parking, someone walking a dog that was not the dog-walking man's dog, a light coming on in the apartment building across the way. The military record, she said, under the name that isn't Voss. Reeves said it wouldn't come up unless I made it come up. That's his call to make, Rourke said. I'd say it's consistent with how he operates. He doesn't use things that aren't his to use. But it's out now. Hale knows. Briggs' team has probably inferred it. Knowing something and making it relevant are different things. He pushed his bowl back slightly. You came here and built something. That's what it is. The rest is background. She looked at him. He was not a comforting person by nature. She didn't think that was what he was going for. But there was something in the statement that was more useful than comfort. It was just true. After he left, she cleaned the 2 bowls and put them away and stood at the kitchen window for a while. The particle board box was on the counter. She'd brought it from the motel out of an instinct she hadn't fully examined yet. She looked at it now. Then she put it back in the closet. Not hidden exactly, just where it lived, behind the off-season clothes, accessible, present, not on display. She went to bed and slept for 8 hours without interruption, which was the most she'd slept in a single stretch in 3 years. The next 2 days moved in the particular way that Aftermath moved. Not slowly, but with a different texture than Crisis. The decisions had been made. The machinery was running. What remained was the processing of consequences. The Oregon State Board of Nursing received the full federal hold documentation and formally acknowledged, in writing, that no adverse action would be taken against Nora Voss's license. The acknowledgement was 3 paragraphs and bureaucratic, and she read it in Frank Adler's office while he watched her with the expression of a man who had spent 10 years expecting these things to go wrong and was still recalibrating. It's good, he said. It's right, she said, which was different. Fair, he said. The Caldwell Register ran a story on Thursday morning about the federal investigation at Heron Valley Medical Center. No names on the nursing side, but a quote from Agent Briggs confirming that the investigation involved alleged intentional patient harm and that charges were pending. The hospital board issued a statement acknowledging the investigation and expressing commitment to transparency and patient safety in language so carefully constructed it said almost nothing, which was what board statements were designed to do. Gerald Pruitt, the board chairman who had photographed himself in front of the trauma wing for the annual report, was not available for comment. Marsh's initial charges were filed Thursday afternoon. Garrett Marsh, former chief of trauma surgery, was charged with obstruction of justice, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy in connection with the death of 3 individuals whose cases had been reopened based on his cooperation. The word conspiracy in the filing connected to language that referenced a federal organized crime statute, which told anyone who read carefully that the charges were going to expand. His bail request was denied. He was held pending trial. Nora read the filing in her apartment on Thursday evening. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. She felt something more complicated. The particular texture of a thing that had been wrong for a long time beginning, slowly, to move toward right. It was not a clean feeling. 4 families were going to receive information this week that would devastate them all over again. A man who had been genuinely skilled at surgery had spent 7 years being something else. None of that was clean. What she felt, after the complicated thing, was a kind of solidity. The ground was where it was supposed to be. The documentation had done what documentation did when it was accurate. It had held. Her phone showed a text from Hale. "They're moving me to a secured facility tomorrow for the duration of recovery. Wanted to say, thank you. Not for the job, for the choice to speak up." She read it twice. Then she typed, "Take care of the drain. Follow up on the hemoglobin at 6 weeks. Don't skip it." A pause. Then, "That's your version of your welcome, I assume." She put the phone down and looked at the street and almost smiled. Friday morning, she arrived at Heron Valley Medical Center at 6:42 a.m. She pulled into the staff lot, cut the engine, sat for one moment with her eyes closed. She did not do the leaving things in the car exercise she usually did. She found she didn't need it the way she'd needed it before. Something had been reorganized internally in the past week. Not resolved, not wrapped up, but differently situated. The way furniture got differently situated when you moved it and found it actually worked better in the new position. She opened her eyes. Put her badge, the replacement badge, issued that morning by hospital administration with a note from Sandra Price that said simply, "Welcome back," around her neck. Got out of the car, walked into the building. Owen was at the desk. He looked up and his expression did something that was not quite professionalism and not quite personal warmth, but was a genuine hybrid of both. "Trauma Bay 1, he said. "We've had 2 in this morning already. Busy week." "When isn't it?" she said. She pulled on her gloves at the trauma bay door. Inside, the secondary team was managing a 41-year-old woman who had come in with blunt abdominal trauma from a fall and was stable, but required monitoring. The attending on duty was a physician she'd worked with twice before, Dr. Angela Sue, a compact, careful woman whose clinical instincts Nora had quietly respected without ever having occasion to say so directly. Sue looked up when Nora entered and gave a single nod that communicated several things at once. Nora moved to the secondary position, the one she'd occupied 4 days ago, and picked up the ultrasound probe. "Fast on entry?" she said. "Fast on entry," Sue confirmed. She positioned the probe. The screen populated. She read it with the same systematic attention she brought to every reading, in every context, in every room she'd ever worked. The image was clear, nothing unexpected, stable. She documented the findings, gloved hands moving over the keyboard, timestamp embedding automatically in the system at 6:51 a.m., and stepped back to allow the team to continue their work. Nobody asked her to justify the exam. Nobody questioned why she'd initiated it. Nobody told her to stay in her lane. She stood at the secondary position and did her job, and the team worked around her with the ordinary, imperfect, high-stakes efficiency of people trying to keep someone alive on an unremarkable Friday morning in Caldwell, Oregon. And then, from the doorway, a resident she didn't recognize leaned in and said, "We've got another incoming, MVC, driver side impact, BP unstable, ETA 4 minutes. Sue looked at Nora. Nora looked at the monitor, at the probe in her hands, at the door. "Get me a second bay ready," she said. What no one in that room knew yet, what Briggs was, at that precise moment, 3 miles away in a federal processing facility, looking at the decrypted contents of the phone they'd taken from the stairwell, was that the third party the 2 arrested men had been communicating with had sent one final message. Sent not to them. Sent to a number that traced, after 2 routing proxies and 1 encrypted relay, to a burner phone that had been purchased in Caldwell 6 weeks ago and was registered to no one. The message was 4 words. Find out who's left. Briggs read the message 3 times. Not because she didn't understand it the first time. She understood it immediately. 4 words, clean syntax, unambiguous intent. She read it 3 times because she was doing what she always did when something significant landed in front of her, which was making sure she wasn't seeing what she expected to see instead of what was actually there. The message said what it said. Find out who's left. She picked up her phone and called the analyst who had pulled the decryption. The burner this was sent to, she said when he answered. Where is it now? Last ping was 48 hours ago, Caldwell City Center, then nothing, either powered down or destroyed. Who bought it? Cash purchase, convenience store on Route 9. 6 weeks ago. Store camera was non-functional. A pause. Whoever bought it knew the camera was non-functional. Which means they'd been in that store before, she said, or they'd done their homework. She hung up and stood very still in the federal processing facility for approximately 4 seconds. Then she called Rourke. The network isn't fully contracted, she said. There's a third node, local, someone who's been in Caldwell long enough to know a specific convenience store's camera was out 6 weeks ago. Rourke said something she didn't hear fully because she was already moving. Get to the hospital, she said. The second MVC arrived at 6:55 a.m. Male, 38, unrestrained passenger in a head-on collision on the interstate bypass. The paramedic report coming over radio said GCS of 12, laceration to the scalp, diminished breath sounds, bilateral, pressure holding at 94/62 but trending. The trauma team in Bay 2 mobilized. Nora was already gloved at the secondary position when the gurney came through the doors, and she absorbed the incoming information the way she always absorbed it, systematically, without drama, prioritizing the data points that mattered over the ones that were noise. The attending was Sue again, who had rotated from Bay 1 after confirming the first patient was stable enough for transfer to observation. She called instructions to the team with the particular economy of someone who had done this enough times that most of the choreography was automatic. IV access, cervical stabilization, airway assessment, the rhythm of a trauma bay functioning correctly. Not perfectly, because nothing in a trauma bay was ever perfect. There were always gaps and adjustments and moments where someone reached for something that wasn't where it was supposed to be, but correctly, which was the only standard that actually mattered. Nora ran the FAST exam. The image was concerning, not definitive, not the same clear picture she'd had with Hale. This was more ambiguous. A small amount of fluid in Morrison's pouch that could be early free blood or could be artifact, the kind of reading that required a second look and a clinical decision. I've got a small amount of free fluid, right upper quadrant, she said. Equivocal. I want to repeat in 3 minutes. Sue looked at the screen, looked at the patient, looked at the pressure readout. Agreed. Keep the probe on. Nobody questioned it. Nobody told her to stay in her lane. She repeated the exam at 6:59. The fluid had increased, definitively. Not massively. This wasn't the hemorrhagic emergency Hale had been, but the trend was clear and the trend was the point. It's growing, she said. Small hepatic laceration, most likely. Stable enough for CT if we move now, but we need to move. CT, Sue said immediately. Let's go. The team moved. Clean, practiced, imperfect in the small human ways that teams always were. Someone's glove snapped. The gurney wheel caught briefly on the bay door threshold. The CT tech wasn't immediately reachable, and Owen had to call twice. But moving, and moving correctly, and Nora walked with the gurney as far as the CT suite entrance and handed off to the imaging team and watched the doors close and stood in the corridor for a moment. That was her job. That was the whole job. Not heroics, not confrontation, not the dramatic vindication of a single moment. Just this. Seeing what was there. Saying what she saw, doing it again. She walked back to the bay. Owen was at the desk when she passed. He looked up. Rourke is here, he said. He's in the lobby. She changed her gloves and went to the lobby. Rourke was standing near the main entrance with Briggs, who had arrived at a speed that suggested she had driven fast and run the last part. They both looked at Nora with the expression of people who had information and were deciding how to sequence it. Tell me, she said. Briggs told her about the message, the burner phone, the 6-week timeline, the convenience store on Route 9. Nora listened without interrupting. 6 weeks ago, she said when Briggs finished. That's 4 weeks before Hale's crash, and yes, which means the network had someone positioned here before the operation, someone who was already embedded and doing reconnaissance. She looked at Briggs. Not one of the two from the stairwell. No, Those two were brought in after the operation failed. This person was already here. Briggs met her eyes. We think they've been here the whole time, watching, feeding information, the crash site, the hospital's intake patterns, staff schedules, camera blind spots. She paused. You. The lobby was doing its ordinary Friday morning things around them. A family at the information desk, a man in a wheelchair being helped toward the entrance, the automatic doors cycling open and shut. The unremarkable institutional texture of a place where people arrived at difficult moments and tried to leave in better condition than they'd arrived. Someone inside the hospital, Nora said. We don't know that. They could be adjacent, a vendor, a contractor, a regular visitor. But the level of operational knowledge about this facility suggests either someone with access or someone who spent a significant amount of time developing access. Nora thought about the 6 weeks. She thought about who she'd seen in and around the hospital in the past weeks. The regular faces that populated the edges of a workplace. The kind of people you stopped consciously seeing because they'd been there long enough to become part of the visual background. She thought about the fabricated staff badges the stairwell men had been carrying. Good quality, Rourke had said, the kind that required either genuine access to the badge system or a very good template. The badge system, she said. Rourke looked at her. The fabricated badges your people found on the stairwell men, how close were they to the real format? Close enough that the volunteer at the front desk didn't flag them, Rourke said. The current badge format changed 8 months ago, Nora said. We all got new ones. The design updated, different color banding, different font on the department designators. Someone who had access to a current badge would have been able to replicate that. Someone working from an old badge or a photograph wouldn't have gotten the details right. Briggs and Rourke looked at each other. Who processes badge replacements? Briggs said. HR, Nora said. And facilities management. They share the system. She watched Briggs' expression shift into the particular focused quality of someone whose investigative thread has just pulled taut in a new direction. I need the personnel files for both departments, Briggs said, pulling out her phone. And I need a federal records request in motion in the next 15 minutes. It took 4 hours. Not because the answer was hidden. It was, in retrospect, not hidden at all, which was how these things usually went. The obviousness arriving fully formed only after you had the key. The key in this case was a cross-reference between the HR department employee roster, the badge system access logs, and a financial database that federal investigators had been building for 7 months as part of the broader network case. The name that emerged was Kevin Stahl. Kevin, who worked at the 4th floor nurses' station. Kevin, who had tried to access Marcus Hale's locked intake record on the night of the crash and been told by the help desk that it was above his access level. Kevin, who had made a note to follow up in the morning and had done exactly that. Not with the help desk, but with a phone call to a number that appeared in the network's communication records under the designation hospital contact, Caldwell. Kevin, who had been employed at Heron Valley for 11 months, who had transferred from a facility in Portland, whose reference letters, when pulled and re-examined, traced to an HR director at the Portland facility who had himself resigned abruptly 4 months ago and whose forwarding address did not exist. Kevin, who was not at the 4th floor nurses' station when Briggs and 2 federal agents went up at 11:30 a.m. He had called in sick at 7:45 a.m. His apartment, when agents arrived at 11:47, was empty. Not vacant. His furniture was there, his food was in the refrigerator, a half-full cup of coffee sat on the kitchen counter, cold. But his go-bag was gone, and the burner phone charging cable on his nightstand connected to nothing, and the laptop that the power cord on his desk suggested had been a fixture was not there. He had left that morning. Probably within an hour of the stairwell arrests making the news through whatever internal channels the network used. Find out who's left. He had found out. And then he had run. Nora learned all of this in pieces, across the course of a Friday that was already a full clinical shift on top of everything else. Briggs called her at noon. Rourke texted her at 1:15. Frank Adler called at 2:00 to tell her that the board had formally processed her reinstatement paperwork and that her employment record had been amended to reflect no adverse action, which was the bureaucratic language for, it's as if the conduct report never happened, which was not quite the same as it never happening, but was the closest the system could get. She ate lunch at her locker. Half a sandwich, warm water, the particular quality of quiet that a break room had at 1:30 on a Friday when most people were either at lunch or in the middle of something they couldn't leave. She thought about Kevin Stahl's cold coffee on the kitchen counter. The small detail of it, the evidence of a morning routine interrupted, the ordinary texture of a life that had been built as a cover and had functioned as a cover and had now been abandoned with the same efficiency with which it had been constructed. He was somewhere in the network's contraction, being moved, probably, repositioned. The network would protect him because he was a thread. They couldn't afford to leave loose, and that meant he would surface eventually, in a different city, under a different name, doing whatever the network needed next. Or he wouldn't. Networks under federal pressure made pragmatic decisions. She finished the sandwich. She did not permit herself to sit with that thought longer than it deserved. It was a real possibility, and she acknowledged it and set it aside. Because what happened to Kevin Stahl now was in Briggs's hands and not hers, and she had patience. At 2:30, the CT patient from the morning, the MVC from the bypass, was moved to surgical prep for a hepatic procedure. Not an emergency, not the hemorrhagic crisis it could have become. An early catch, treated in time, the outcome trajectory bending toward recovery because someone had run the exam and read the trend and said something before the window closed. The surgeon on call for his procedure was Dr. Angela Sue, who had also taken the trauma shift that morning, because Heron Valley was a mid-sized hospital in a mid-sized city, and sometimes one person covered a lot of ground. Before she went into the OR, Sue stopped at the trauma bay entrance where Nora was charting and said, without preamble or ceremony, "Good read this morning." "The trend was clear," Nora said. "It wasn't clear at first," Sue said. "That's the read that matters." She went to the OR. Nora went back to her charting. Garrett Marsh's first federal court appearance was on a Thursday, 3 weeks after his arrest. Nora didn't attend. She was working a day shift and she had patience, and the courthouse was not a place she needed to be to know what was happening there. Frank texted her updates from the hallway during breaks. The charges had expanded from the initial filing, 2 additional counts of conspiracy, a civil RICO predicate that the prosecutor's office had been building for months, and an obstruction charge that specifically referenced the attempted alteration of Marcus Hale's surgical record on the morning after the crash. Marsh appeared in a suit that was expensive and the wrong choice, which Frank communicated by texting simply, he wore the suit with the specific energy of a man who had been in enough legal proceedings to know that defendants who dressed for their old life rather than their new one were doing something self-defeating and couldn't stop themselves. His attorney entered a not guilty plea on all counts. This was expected and strategic and meaningless, given the recorded cooperation sessions and the documentary record and the testimony of a federal operative who was, by that point, recovered enough to sit in a room and tell people clearly and in detail what he remembered about arriving at Heron Valley Medical Center and the specific conversation he had overheard, partially, between Marsh and a person on a phone, before losing consciousness. Bail was denied again. He was remanded. The families of the 4 patients, the 3 whose deaths had been reopened as homicide investigations, and the 4th, whose death had been reclassified as a suspicious complication requiring further review, were notified that week. Nora didn't know the details of those conversations. She knew they happened because Briggs told her, on a call that was briefer and quieter than their earlier conversations, that the families had been contacted and that several of them had already retained counsel for civil action against the hospital. "They deserve the truth," Nora said. "They're getting it," Briggs said, "slowly and painfully and through legal channels that were not designed for speed, but they're getting it." "Is that the best we can do?" A pause. "In this system? Usually, yes." Another pause. "Sometimes the best we can do is make sure it doesn't get buried again." 2 weeks after the court appearance, the hospital board held an emergency session that was reported in the Caldwell Register as a governance review, but was understood by everyone inside the institution as the board trying to determine how much of what had happened was going to land on them specifically. Gerald Pruitt announced his resignation as board chairman at the end of the session. The press release called it a personal decision made to allow the hospital to move forward. The timing made the actual reason sufficiently clear that the press release was somewhat beside the point. The CMO, who had processed Marsh's conduct report against Nora through his office, whose name was Dr. Robert Fenwick, and who had been at Heron Valley for 12 years, and who had never liked Marsh particularly, but had understood the political architecture well enough to work within it, submitted a letter of apology to the nursing department that was 3 paragraphs long and specific in a way that suggested it had not been written by a lawyer. He apologized for the speed of the administrative action. He apologized for the failure to conduct a patient safety review before the leave was processed. He said, in the second paragraph, that the nursing documentation had been available in the system from the beginning, and that a review of that documentation before any administrative action would have produced a different outcome, and that the failure to conduct that review was his. It landed differently than the legal team's withdrawal email had landed. Not because it changed anything, the material facts were already resolved, but because it was a person saying a thing rather than a document performing a function. Nora read it at her kitchen table. She sat with it for a while. Then she wrote back a 4-line response that said she acknowledged the apology, that she understood the pressures of the structure he'd been working within, and that what mattered going forward was that the structure changed. She did not say she forgave him, because that wasn't hers to decide at that moment. And she wasn't sure forgiveness was the right frame for institutional failures anyway. She said what was true and left the rest for time to work out. The protocol review meeting happened on a Wednesday afternoon in the 3rd week of November. It was less dramatic than it sounds. A conference room on the 2nd floor, a table with 8 people around it. Sandra Price, 2 attending physicians, including Sue, 2 senior nurses, including Nora, the new interim department chair, a representative from risk management, and a compliance officer who was there to make sure whatever they decided was documentable. The agenda was the standing orders for trauma assessment, specifically the language around point-of-care ultrasound and the scope of nursing-initiated diagnostic exams. The current language was ambiguous in the way that legal language often became ambiguous over time. Clear enough when it was written, eroded by layers of institutional practice and individual interpretation until the text said one thing and the actual operating standard was something else entirely. The ambiguity had been used as a weapon. It didn't need to stay ambiguous. Nora had come prepared. She had 3 pages of proposed language revisions, which she had written carefully over 2 weeks, cross-referencing national emergency nursing standards and guidelines from the Society of Trauma Nurses and the language used by 4 other hospitals with established fast protocol frameworks. She had not been dramatic about it. She had treated it as a clinical document, which was what it was. Sandra presented the revisions on her behalf. Nora's suggestion, because Sandra's institutional authority would carry the language further than hers in a room that was still finding its footing with her. The interim chair read through the 3 pages. The risk management rep asked 2 questions. Sue said, "This is correct. This is what the standard should have been," and then said nothing else, which was the most useful contribution possible. The revisions were approved with 2 minor edits. The new standing orders would take effect the following month and would apply to all nursing staff in the trauma and emergency departments, with mandatory orientation for current staff. The language was clear. The scope was unambiguous. A nurse in that trauma bay who identified a diagnostic finding and acted on it would have standing, real, documented, procedurally supported standing that had not existed in the same form before. Walking out of the conference room, Sandra caught up with her in the corridor. "How do you feel?" Sandra asked. Nora considered the question honestly. "Like it should have been this way before," she said. "Yes," Sandra said. "It should have." They walked together to the elevator in the particular silence of people who had said the real thing and didn't need to add to it. Kevin Stahl was found in mid-December, not in Oregon. Not anywhere Nora would have predicted, though she recognized when Briggs told her that she probably shouldn't have been trying to predict it. He was in a mid-sized city in a different state, in an apartment rented under a name that had been professionally constructed, the kind of identity that took resources and infrastructure to build. He had been working at a medical facility under the new name, which was the detail that stayed with Nora after the call ended, the particular detail she held and turned over. He had gone back to what he knew, what he was positioned to do. Another hospital, another set of corridors, another network of patients, whose information and vulnerabilities could be observed and fed outward to people who used it. He was arrested without incident on a Wednesday morning. Federal charges, multiple counts, including conspiracy and the obstruction charge connected to his access of Hale's record on the night of the crash. Briggs called Nora herself to tell her. "It's done," she said. "The whole network?" Nora said. A pause. This chapter of it, these people, these operations, the financial structure we've been tracing, we've made arrests in 4 cities. The procurement fraud Hale was investigating has gone to trial. 3 convictions so far, 2 more pending. She sounded tired in a clean way. The exhaustion of someone who had run a long race and finished it. There will always be other chapters. That's the work. But this one is closed. Nora stood at her kitchen window. December in Caldwell, the trees bare, the street below dry and gray in the way of places waiting for snow that hadn't come yet. "Thank you for calling," she said. "You're the reason any of this got to close," Briggs said. "I want you to know that, not because of the military background, not because of anything except that you were in a trauma bay on a Tuesday morning and you said something true in a room that didn't want to hear it." A brief pause. "That's actually the whole case. Everything else was scaffolding." Nora didn't respond immediately. "How is Hale?" she said. "Recovered, back in a consulting role. He asked me to tell you, and I quote, that the drain follow-up went fine and his hemoglobin is where it should be." This time she did smile. It came out full, unguarded, the kind of smile that happened before you could decide whether to have it. "Good," she said. She didn't mark the end of the year in any particular way. She worked Christmas Eve, which she'd volunteered for because she had no specific reason not to, and there were people on the team with children who had a better use for the day. The trauma bay on Christmas Eve was what it always was. Not quiet, not slow, just different. The specific quality of human difficulty that arrived in emergency rooms on holidays, which tended to be the same human difficulty that arrived on other days, but with an additional layer of grief or irony or exhaustion that made it heavier. A woman came in at 9 p.m., 63, slip and fall on ice, hip pain but walking, more shaken than injured. Her daughter came with her and held her hand through the entire assessment and cried twice with the specific crying of someone who had been scared and was now watching the scare resolve and couldn't quite let go of the fear yet. Nora sat with them after the imaging came back clear, fracture ruled out, soft tissue injury, manageable, send home instructions, and talked through the care plan in plain language, made sure the daughter understood what to watch for, made sure the mother knew it was okay to call back if anything changed. The daughter looked at her before they left. "Thank you," she said, "for sitting with us." "That's the job," Nora said. She meant it completely, not as a deflection, as a genuine statement of what the job was, at its actual core, when you stripped away the politics and the documentation requirements and the administrative structures that could be weaponized or corrupted or simply broken by the weight of institutional pressure. The job was sitting with someone in a hard moment and making sure they knew what to do next. That was it. That was everything. The woman in the hip injury case went home at 10 p.m. with her daughter and her discharge papers and a recommendation for a follow-up appointment that she would probably actually keep because her daughter would make her. Nora charted the visit and stretched her back and drank coffee that was too old and needed to be replaced and went back to the bay. At 11:47 p.m., with 13 minutes left in her shift, a critical came through. She didn't know the details yet. She heard the radio call from the entrance. Motor vehicle, male, 20s, BP unstable, GCS fluctuating. And she pulled her gloves on at the bay door and took her position at the secondary station and waited for the gurney with the same still attention she brought to every incoming, which was not the absence of feeling but the disciplined management of it. The way you kept your hands steady, not by not feeling anything, but by knowing where to put what you felt. The attending tonight was a physician named Dr. Marcus Webb, a solid emergency specialist who had been at Heron Valley for 3 years and who communicated with his team with a directness that Nora appreciated. No performance, no hierarchy for its own sake, just information moving efficiently in the direction it needed to move. The gurney came through the doors. Webb called the initial assessment. Nora started IV access and reached for the ultrasound probe in the same motion, the way the new standing orders now explicitly supported, without waiting, without asking, without looking over her shoulder. She ran the probe. She read what it showed. She said what she saw. Free fluid, left upper quadrant, significant. Possible splenic injury. This is the primary source. Webb looked at the screen for 2 seconds. "Get me OR1, he said to the room. "Blood bank, type and cross for 6 units. Let's move." The team moved. Nora walked with the gurney as far as the elevator, handed off, came back to the bay. She stood in the space the gurney had occupied. The bay quiet now in the aftermath of urgency. The monitor showing only its default standby readouts, the clean, sharp smell of antiseptic, and the hum of the ventilation system. She thought about the first time she'd stood in this bay, 2 years ago, learning the layout, figuring out where the supplies were, reading the team dynamics with the same careful attention she'd always brought to new environments. She thought about what she'd wanted then, which was to disappear into the work, to be useful without being visible, to practice the discipline of not being seen. She had been good at it. She had built it deliberately and maintained it carefully, and it had served its purpose until the morning in September when a man had arrived on a gurney and the ultrasound had shown what it showed and the silence had been the wrong choice in the wrong moment. She had not been destroyed by speaking. She had not lost what she'd built. She had lost the version of it that required her to be invisible. And what she'd found on the other side of that loss was something harder to maintain and more honest to inhabit. A version of the same work that didn't ask her to pretend to be less than she was. That was the thing about rooms that told you to stay in your lane. They didn't actually want less from you. They wanted a particular kind of compliance that looked like less. The lane they were assigning was designed to fit what they'd decided about you before you opened your mouth. And the trouble with that kind of design was that it didn't survive contact with an actual emergency. In an actual emergency, reality had its own requirements, and reality did not care what anyone had decided in advance. She had stood in a lot of rooms like that. Different contexts, different uniforms, same fundamental dynamic, the automatic diminishment of a person who didn't match the expected profile, the casual certainty of people with institutional authority that they knew more than they needed to know to dismiss you. She had learned, over time, that the answer was not loudness. It was not confrontation for its own sake, not the performance of capability, not the elaborate demonstration of credentials. The answer was the same thing every time. Say what was true. Stay in the room. Let the moment decide what the moment needed. The moment always needed what was true. She pulled off her gloves. She threw them in the disposal. She went to the sink and washed her hands the way she always washed them. 20 seconds. Soap, rinse, methodical. The new year was 8 days away. The standing orders were in effect. The families of 4 people who had died in this building had lawyers now, and the truth, and whatever kind of beginning those two things together could make. Marsh was in a federal facility awaiting trial. Stahl was in custody. Reeves was somewhere doing the work that Reeves did, and Rourke was wherever Rourke went between things like this, and Hale was sitting at a desk in a city she didn't know with hemoglobin at the right level and a scar on his left lateral abdomen that had healed cleanly. The work had been done. Not all of it. The work was never all of it. The work was continuous. It regenerated itself constantly from the raw material of human fragility and human crisis and the gap between what systems promised and what they delivered. But this piece of it, this specific bounded 7 weeks of her life piece of it, had been done. She thought about what Hale had said in the hospital room. Thank you, not for the job, for the choice to speak up. She had not known, in the moment she spoke up, that it would become what it became. She had not made the calculation that this was a network operation, or that the attending's negligence was intentional, or that 7 years of falsified records were resting under the surface of that Tuesday morning. She had made one calculation, which was the calculation she always made. The monitor was showing something, the ultrasound was showing something, the patient was dying, and silence was the wrong choice. That was the whole calculation, and that, she thought, was the thing nobody ever told you about courage. Not the military textbook version, not the version that got written into award citations. The actual version was much smaller and much less dramatic. It was almost always just the decision to say the accurate thing in a room where the accurate thing wasn't welcome. It didn't require exceptional training or a hidden background or a set of classified credentials. It required the capacity to tolerate the specific discomfort of a room that wanted you to be quiet, and to open your mouth anyway, and to accept whatever came next. Most people had that capacity. Most people had been told, at some point, that they didn't. The radio on the desk crackled. Owen's voice from the main station. Bay 1, we've got another incoming. Possible cardiac event, female, 68, ETA 6 minutes. Nora pulled a fresh pair of gloves from the dispenser. She moved to her position at the secondary station. She checked the monitor. She checked the supply cart, ran a fast visual on the equipment, confirmed the defibrillator was charged because it was always supposed to be charged, and she always confirmed it anyway. She did all of this in approximately 90 seconds, without urgency and without hesitation, with the particular quality of attention that was not dramatic and not invisible, but simply present. The bay doors opened. She was ready. That was the end of it and the beginning of it. The same moment, the same bay, the same fluorescent lights, and the same antiseptic smell, and the same hum of machinery keeping track of the things that mattered. She had been dismissed in this room, and she had been right in this room, and she had been threatened and documented and reinstated, and none of it had changed the fundamental nature of what happened when the doors opened and someone in crisis came through them. The person who came through those doors did not care what had been said about her or decided about her or filed against her. They came through because they needed someone who could see what was there and say what it was and act on it without waiting for permission. She was that person. She had always been that person. The difference was that now the room knew it too.